This slideshow is on Kirtland opposition. Basically, during the history of the church, they've had a lot of trials and tribulations and times where they faced a lot of persecution from people who weren't members of the church and didn't want them to be living in the same areas with them or had issues with some of the beliefs that the church members practiced. And so this slideshow is to better understand the reasoning behind most of that. So this is a quotation from Thomas B. Marsh, who spoke outwardly against Joseph Smith to try and rally people behind him in making them believe untrue and cruel things about Joseph Smith. He said, "I have heard the prophets say that he should yet tread down his enemies, and walk over their dead bodies, that if he was not let alone, he would be a second Mohammed to this generation, and that he would make it one gore of blood from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean, that like Mohammed, whose motto is treating for peace, was Al-Quran or the sword, so should it be eventually with us, Joseph Smith or the sword." A lot of these things that were said about Joseph Smith were just not true, but were people who really didn't like him and really didn't like members of the church and would just do anything that they could. They'd go to all costs to try and get rid of them. There was a big struggle in the early church also with racial prejudices. Church leadership invited people of color to worship in Jackson County, Missouri, to seek refuge from persecution. And the other Jackson County residents became angry and by violent measures forced church leaders to take the church elsewhere. This was, as we know, there was a common theme in the 1800s in the United States of racial prejudice, and it would be difficult to be a black man in this time period and to obtain personal rights, to be able to own property, or to be able to worship as you wished. And our church wanted to welcome them and allow them to come into our congregations and to live in the community with them in Jackson County, Missouri, and so they welcomed them. But the other citizens in the area were enraged by this, and it brought on only more persecution to the church. Another way that the church was persecuted was by a banking intervention. The church members began to prosper exceedingly in Kirtland, Ohio, and so they tried to start a bank called the Kirtland Safety Society. And because they had so much wealth, they had many resources and a lot of wealth, but the other settlers in the area wouldn't have it. So what happened was the LDS Church, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in Kirtland, Ohio, put together their money and set up a system of banking. And it would have worked fine because they had so much wealth and resources, and it was sufficient for the members' needs and for the other people living in the area. But because they were disliked by the other residents in Kirtland, they caused a run on the bank to exhaust it of its resources and caused the bank to fail. It probably wouldn't have happened if they weren't persecuted, but because they were openly attacked, the bank had to fail. Another big issue was in Caldwell, Missouri. After being forced out of Independence, Missouri, the state allowed for the city of Caldwell to be occupied by members of the church. As in Ohio, the church members began to prosper greatly and grow in numbers. As they rose to pose more of a threat politically and economically, the neighboring cities grew hostile again. By 1838, non-members tried to obstruct members of the church from voting, which resulted in a riot which increased the animosity between the two groups. Even later, there was an order for extermination, where General Boggs issued an extermination order on the Mormons. He said, "The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace. Their outrages are beyond all description." 1,800 militia members surrounded their town and ordered for Joseph Smith to submit to arrest. Joseph and other leaders were taken prisoner. After being incarcerated, the Mormons' town was attacked and robbed. A general ordered for the execution of the leaders, but the executioner refused. "It is cold-blooded murder. I will not obey your order, and if you execute these men, I will hold you responsible before an earthly tribunal, so help me God." Doniphan's threat caused the General Lucas to back down, declaring that the prisoners instead would be confined to jail. So, on all these false charges and issues being made where the members of this church weren't even making a problem, they were just bringing peace and thriving, economically and physically. The leaders of the nation were super unhappy with them and tried to execute Joseph Smith and other church leaders without any proper grounds. And so luckily there was a man like Doniphan who stood up against them and prevented this execution, even though they were still wrongfully placed in jail. Some of the results that came from the opposition are interesting because you would think that if you face so much persecution, it would be easy just to give up and take a hint. But the church members were really persistent. And so one thing that happened was Joseph received many revelations that are recorded in Doctrine and Covenants, another book of scripture we have. So a lot of scriptures we have were from Joseph Smith while he was facing so much persecution, probably because instead of giving up, he turned to God to receive more strength. Many false charges were placed on the prophet and the members of the church as a whole. Times were very difficult for the church to have the prophet in jail, and the strain was put on many people. But lastly, the struggle served to bring all who remained faithful closer to God and become even stronger. I wanted to include one of the revelations that Joseph received as part of the suffering that he endured. And so this one is found in D&C section 121, verses 1 through 6. And he says, O God, where art thou, and where is the pavilion that covereth thy hiding place? How long shall thy hand be stayed, and thine eye, yea, thy pure eye, behold from the eternal heavens the wrongs of thy people and of thy saints, and thine ear be penetrated with their cries? Yea, O Lord, how long shall they suffer these wrongs and unlawful oppressions, before thine heart shall be softened toward them, and thy bowels be moved with compassion toward them? O Lord God Almighty, maker of heaven, earth, and seas, and of all things that in them are, and who controllest and subjectest the devil, and the dark and benighted dominion of Sheol, stretch forth thy hand, let thine eye pierce, let thy pavilion be taken up, let thy hiding place no longer be covered, let thine ear be inclined, let thine heart be softened, and thy bowels moved with compassion toward us. Let thine anger be kindled against our enemies, and, in the fury of thine heart, with thy sword avenge us of our wrongs. Remember thy suffering saints, O our God, and thy servants will rejoice in thy name forever. And so here, it's really clear that Joseph is having a hard time with what he's going through, and trying to support the saints while he's being under such heavy persecution. And so I wanted to include on the next slide the Lord's response. So the following verses in the same section are verses 7 through 11, and this is the Lord's response to Joseph's supplication. And he said, My son, peace be unto thy soul. Thine adversity and thine afflictions shall be but a small moment, and then, if thou endure it well, God shall exalt thee on high. Thou shalt triumph over all thy foes. Thy friends do stand by thee, and they shall hail thee again with warm hearts and friendly hands. Thou art not yet as Job. Thy friends do not contend against thee, neither charge thee with transgression as they did Job. And they who do charge thee with transgression, their hope shall be blasted, and their prospects shall melt away, as the hoar frost melteth before the burning rays of the rising sun. And then again, as always, I'll send you this PowerPoint, and you can click on here to view the rest of the revelation between Joseph Smith and God. But it's really interesting how merciful God is, and how he doesn't necessarily take away the struggles from Joseph Smith, but he tells him that if he endures it well, it will be for his good. And I think that that's something that we can all learn and apply to our own individual lives, that when we have problems, God won't just take them away from us, but if we turn to him, he can help us get through them, and we'll be able to learn something from them. And so then, just to close this slide, I have an invitation as always, and this one is to let your struggles bring you closer to Christ and strengthen your relationship with him. I think that there's something that we can learn from everything, and it's better to let our struggles bring us closer to God and to Jesus Christ than it is to let them take us away from them. I hope you enjoyed.